Hi everyone. I wanted to do an intro video into adventure racing and also into expedition racing um, as a way to give people a sense of how they can follow along for this big race. I know many of you have heard me talking about a lot, which is Expedition Ozarks coming up April 8th to the 13th. This is my very first expedition length adventure race. The longest I've ever done is 30 hours. The longest my usual teammate has done is 30 hours. And then our third teammate, she is going to be, I think, on her fourth expedition race. So she's going to be really the our mentor for showing us the ropes of how we get through this. But I know that some of you are tuning into adventure racing for the first time and going to be dot watching us for the first time, which I am so thrilled to hear that people are interested. I really appreciate it. It means so much. But I know that some people are new to the sport, so I wanted to do a little video to go over some of the basics. And then in a second video, I'll talk about actually how the dot watching process works. So hopefully it's not too confusing to follow along. So adventure racing, I think as many of you know, is a multi-sport sport. And it usually contains a combination of mountain biking, paddling, and hiking in any length and any distance. Some races you do each sport once, sometimes you do each sport multiple times. It just sort of depends on the length of the race and what the race director decides to do. It can be entirely different for every race. The shortest adventure races I've ever seen are anywhere between 3 and 6 hours, and then the longest ones, such as the expedition races, can go anywhere between 3 to 14 days. So for this one, it's going to be a 5 day. This is the second year that this race has run, and so we're really excited to take a crack at it. So. The way that adventure racing works is that at the beginning of the race, you're going to get a set of maps. And I have a sample map here that you can take a peek at. We're going to have multiple maps for this race. Some race directors prefer to have fewer maps, but the maps are really, really large. Some of them will give you 20 maps that are like, more like regular, the size of a piece of paper. So this is an example of the type of maps that we'll be getting for the race. Each race has a start and a finish. And in between, there's going to be a series of what's called checkpoints. We usually refer to them as CPs. On this map, as you can see, there's a checkpoint right here. So this map is an example of something you might see as a map in the middle of a race. So there's no start and finish listed. It's just a map where there's a couple of CPs on it. Yeah, it looks like for this was like an example of map 28. So they must have gotten a lot of maps for this race. So again, going back to the checkpoints, we're going to be navigating with map and compass to each checkpoint. Sometimes you have to do them in order, sometimes you don't. Typically, for each leg that you're on, meaning we're doing a bike leg and then a paddle leg and then a trekking leg, you have to complete the checkpoints within those legs, and you can't later in the race go back to checkpoints that were in different legs. So if we're on leg 5, we've got to do all the checkpoints in leg 5. We can't do checkpoints from any other leg while we're doing that. So for instance, this is going to be leg 5 checkpoint 2. That's the way that the numbers work. So this is, let's say the race was first, it was a trek, and then it was a paddle, and then it was another trek, and then another paddle, and then leg 5, it looks like this is a biking leg. And so leg 5 is a bike. You're going to be figuring out how we can bike to each checkpoint and then move on to the next checkpoint. What the checkpoints actually are when we get to them are these orange and white kind of lampshade looking sort of flags. They're sort of three-sided lampshades almost, and in the middle there's going to be a way to score that we've been to that checkpoint. Sometimes it's electronic, sometimes it's a piece of paper that we punch, and then we carry the piece of paper with us. That's sort of what's called our passport. That is how we get scored at the end of the race. Top teams are going to try to clear every single checkpoint, so they're going to try to get checkpoint 2 on leg 5, checkpoint 3 on leg 5, and this is what's called a pro point, which for this race means that um, it's an optional checkpoint. And the reason it's called a pro point is because it's assumed that the pro teams, the ones who are really trying to win the race or get as close to winning as possible, are going to be the teams that are trying to focus in on getting these checkpoints done. So for us, we're probably going to be more focusing on the mandatory checkpoints like 502 and 503. And the top teams will be making sure they're also getting all of those pro points. So that's kind of how the maps look. There's features on here like roads that are off limits. And so we take that into account in terms of how we come up with our path getting between checkpoints. So if we're moving from 502 to 503, what we're going to do is come up this road probably and then sneak on this road over here. And that way we're avoiding these off limits areas. So that's kind of an example of how we'd be navigating from checkpoint to checkpoint. After we finish each leg, we're going to get to something called a transition area. And that's really where we are transitioning in between one sport to another, one leg to another. So we'd be moving from potentially mountain biking to paddling or something like that. For this race, they have sent out a layout of what each leg is going to look like. And so this will give you an idea of kind of how this race layout is going to work. For this race, we're going to be, again, starting on the 8th in the morning sometime. We don't exactly know when, we just know it's going to be in the morning. And then the first thing we do is we go out on a trekking leg. For this race, this first leg is the monster leg. It's going to be the biggest leg on the course. The minimum distance is going to be 59 miles, which means that, again, that's the distance for if you're just doing the mandatory checkpoints. And then the maximum distance for those pro teams who are going to want to be getting the mandatory checkpoints and all the optional checkpoints, they're going to be doing more like 67 miles. They are also going to be moving very fast. So it's anticipated they'll finish that leg in 20 hours. And for those of us who are newer teams, less experienced, and maybe will have trouble with the navigation or just not be moving as fast, the race director thinks that maybe we'll finish that leg in about 30 hours maximum. Then we get into these transition areas. It's listed here that we'll see our bike box and our gear bin. That means that when we know we're seeing our bike box, that means that we're going to be heading out on a bike leg right afterwards. So when we get the bike boxes, we build our bikes. And then we also can use the gear bins to resupply. We bring our own gear bins, we pack them in advance and we use this course schematic can decide how we want to pack those gear bins so that we make sure we can resupply appropriately when we get to the end of each leg at the TAs. And so the race director will then move the gear bins and the bike boxes and the paddle bags down the race course for us while we are out on each leg. So, once we finish this bike leg, we'll see our bike box again. We'll pack up our bikes, head out on the paddle leg, and then the race director will move our bike box to wherever TA5 is going to be, where we then unpack, do our bikes again, and then keep going. So this gives you an idea, again, of how the course is laid out. If you see a leg where the maximum distance and the minimum distance are the same, that just means that every checkpoint on that leg is probably going to be mandatory. So we're all going to be doing the same amount of distance and probably in a similar amount of time. Down here at the end of the race, you'll see that there are a couple of legs right at the end where there's actually no minimum distance. And what that means is you don't have to do any of that leg. Those legs, the entirety of those legs is completely optional. That's probably there because they're wanting to make sure that top teams that are moving really fast can have an extra challenge to really work hard to clear that course. And so, they're going to be out there trying to complete every single leg and every single checkpoint. And for a team like ours, where we're more beginners, we may not be moving fast enough to finish all of these legs. So this is the way that the race director makes the race accessible for both pro teams and more beginner teams so that we'll still be official finishers if we end up not doing either of those legs. So at that point, we would get to TA8, and then we'd probably just head for the finish line, and then we would be considered official finishers, which is very helpful to know that we have those options as newer expedition racers. So those are kind of the basics of how adventure racing is laid out. It's a team sport. We're going to have 3 people on our team. Most teams will be 4-person co-ed. That's considered the sort of premier division on international races. That's kind of what everyone's aiming for to be competitive, like worldwide. Um, Other than that, we don't have a lot of information about kind of what this race is going to be like. We do know that it sounds like there's maybe going to be some rappelling on this race and potentially some rock climbing. So in addition to the paddling, trekking, and hiking, we'll have those extra little bits of excitement. But sometimes races have stand-up paddleboarding. Sometimes I've heard there's a race happening internationally that is going to have, I think, camel riding. And so it just kind of depends on what the race director wants to do. But for this race, it's going to be pretty straightforward. So now I'm going to move over to a second video and talk a little bit about how you actually are going to be able to keep track of us during this race. And hopefully having this intro for how adventure racing actually works will clarify how then you can follow along with the dot watching and make it less confusing. So tune in for the second video, and I really appreciate all of you who are interested in following along. This is a very exciting experience for me, and it means a lot that you guys are interested in keeping an eye on us as we're out there racing. So I'll see you for the second video.